Next Chapter Podcasts.
From the history of radioactive makeup to all the loony things Henry VIII did to ensure we never stop making movies about him, Weird History is a podcast that answers all the questions you didn't even know you had about the most unbelievable people, places, and events of the past. Based on the hugely successful YouTube channel, Weird History invites you to bone up on what it was like to use a public bathroom in ancient Rome while learning about the single worst year of all time. Don't worry, we missed it by a millennium or so. Then get the skinny on modern history, like the true story behind The Conjuring, and just what the hell Steven Seagal did to get banned from SNL. Let Weird History be your guide to the stranger side of history they don't teach you in school. Because the past is weird, a lot weirder than you think. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.
The world is growing more complicated by the day, but too often, everyone seems to be operating on the same old assumptions about global affairs. But if you're not sure that world domination by the United States is the right path for America or the world, or if you've got questions about conventional geopolitical thinking, you should check out American Prestige, a foreign policy podcast from a different perspective. Every week on American Prestige, historian and former Bernie Sanders foreign policy advisor Daniel Bessner, that's me, and my co-host, the journalist Derek Davison, analyze U.S. foreign policy from a critical framework that sheds light on myriad topics related to international affairs. So, if you're curious to know what U.S. foreign policy would look like if the interests of all people in the world, and not only rich Americans, were taken into account, then check out American Prestige at AmericanPrestigePod.com. That's AmericanPrestigePod.com. And you could, of course, also find us on your favorite podcast app.
For us, we knew that, prior to Dungeon Family, which produced Outkast and produced, Goody Mob and so many other great acts, that we were already forging this path for Atlanta and for the South.
So it's like hip-hop has manifested and made itself unique in all of these different states. All of these different trends and all of these different, significant core moments have happened in Southern hip-hop, and they are crossing over because folks are seeing value in it. I had a friend of mine visit Tibet and sent me a link of Tibetan monks chanting to trap music. Like they were chanting to trap beats.
You know what I'm saying? It's like we got a demo tape and nobody want to hear it, but it's like this, the South got something to say.
Hello, and welcome to Our New South, a podcast series presented by Levine Museum of the New South in Charlotte, North Carolina. Levine Museum connects the past to the future to realize the promises of a New South. To learn more and donate to projects like this, visit museumofthenewsouth.org. Hi, my name is Kevin Blackistone of the Washington Post, coming to you from the University of Maryland, where I teach, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Robert Greene II, a professor of history at Claflin University. Our New South Season 2 explores the complexities of the many New Souths that make up today's New South. The series highlights opportunities and challenges that different communities face, diving into censorship and healthcare, tourism and religion, struggles for rights and resources, and the global reverberations of New South culture.
We thank you for joining us on this journey and for making the show a Signal Award and Anthem Award winner. Follow the show, rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. Okay, let's get to today's episode of the show.
The South got something to say.
Today's episode of Our New South focuses on hip-hop in the South. In the Our New South theme music, the first voice you hear is Andre 3000 from Outkast at the 1995 Source Awards. He takes the podium and declares that the South's got something to say. So hip-hop has been a part of the DNA of this show since day one, and the subject is near and dear to our hearts. For this episode, we have two compelling conversations about the evolution of hip-hop in the South. Before we get to our guests, I would like to ask Dr. Robert Greene to provide us with some brief insight on hip-hop in the South.
Hip-hop's origins in the Bronx in the early 1970s have become part of American history and legend. However, while the influence of New York City and the Caribbean on hip-hop cannot be denied, what is also clear is that by the 1990s, the U.S. South also began to have a critical influence on the genre. Across the region, from Atlanta to Houston, from Memphis to New Orleans, and many points urban and rural in between, the South began to speak up and make its presence felt in hip-hop. Brief hit acts out of the South, such as the Sequence of Columbia, South Carolina, achieved fame in 1979. The all-female group was led by a young Angie Stone, who would achieve greater prominence as an R&B act. By the late 1980s, hip-hop acts began to grow organically across the South. Groups such as the Ghetto Boys of Houston became known first locally and later nationally. Arrested Development also rose out of the rural South to give voice to generations of Black Americans who continued to live on the lands of their ancestors. And of course, by 1995, Outkast would make sure that Southern hip-hop had a permanent space in the musical consciousness of America, and eventually the world. Quote, "We got a demo tape and don't nobody want to hear it," said Andre 3000 the night of the 1995 Source Awards to a hostile audience in New York. But it's like the South got something to say. That's all I'm going to say, end quote. Since then, the U.S. South has not stopped talking, rapping, rhyming, and dancing. By the early 21st century, distinctive styles of hip-hop had developed across the South, from the juke dance and unique sound of Memphis, Tennessee, to the jazz and blues-infused hip-hop of New Orleans led by Master P's No Limit Records, and also Cash Money Records, which gave us Juvenile and Lil Wayne, to the bass-heavy sounds of Miami rap pioneered by First Amendment advocate Uncle Luke, and the plethora of artists such as Outkast, Killer Mike, Ludacris, CeeLo Green, and T.I., all calling Atlanta home. In addition, a new generation of female hip-hop artists, such as Glorilla of Memphis, Megan Thee Stallion of Houston, Texas, have added a distinctly Black female voice to hip-hop. Finally, artists such as Big Freedia of New Orleans remind us that hip-hop's future may very well lie in understanding and embracing gender nonconformity, along with challenging other assumptions and stereotypes about Black life in America. With the recent celebration of the 50th anniversary of the creation of hip-hop, the South can proudly look at its influence on the genre. The next 50 years will likely include a variety of new South influences, including musical stylings from Latin America and Afro beats from Sub-Saharan Africa. But this is merely the continuation of a long lineage of Black America mixing and remixing other cultural influences to create something fresh.
Our first guest is Speech. He is a founding member of the Atlanta-based hip-hop group Arrested Development, winning 2 Grammy Awards in 1993 for Best Rap Performance by a Duo or Group and Best New Artist, making them the first hip-hop artist to win this award. They were also named Band of the Year by Rolling Stone magazine. Arrested Development have a new album out called Bullets in the Chamber. Our New South welcomes Speech.
All right. So we are honored and pleased to have with us on Our New South, Speech, rapper from the group Arrested Development. So first, Speech, before we really dive into today's interview, could you tell us a bit about yourself in terms of who you are and what you do for a living and what you're up to these days?
Well, yeah, my name is Speech from the group, hip-hop group Arrested Development. And we've been out since 1992 as far as in the public eye. And we still, to this day, create music. It's been 32 years, and we release albums. We tour the world. We've won numerous Grammys and MTV Awards and sold well over 5 million albums. And we do a lot of things musically and artistically throughout the world, but also consciously. So yeah, we've, just striving to make a mark in music and succeeding in a lot of ways. So.
Well, I will have to make a confession right here. I'm trying not to geek out about this interview because as somebody who grew up in Georgia in the 1990s, I grew up listening to a lot of Arrested Development. It was very much part of the soundtrack of my life. And so for me, this is an important interview and a really special interview. And I have to start off by asking about your upbringing. You're actually originally from Milwaukee. You spent time between Milwaukee and rural Tennessee growing up. How first did that influence your life, especially how you thought about the South, going from Milwaukee to rural Tennessee, going back and forth so much?
Yeah, so I spent all my summers and pretty much most of my summers as a child in rural Tennessee, a small town called Glimp, Tennessee. And population was probably 1,000 at most. And for me, the South was a place of self-determination for Black people. Most everybody I knew about agriculture, and they were excellent with the land and with the water, and we got our water from a well. And most everyone I knew back then was relatively self-sufficient. I mean, they raised their own livestock. They raised their own vegetables and fruits. Most everyone I knew a lot about self-care. They were knowledgeable with like medicinal herbs and treatments and things of this nature. And they also followed a community code of conduct without it being said a lot. It was just this sense of helping one another. There was a sense of respecting the elders. There was a strong sense of spirituality. A lot of people were very strong in this sense of surrender to a higher power, in sense of prayer, in a sense of forgiveness. So yeah, I mean, those were things that I noticed about the South as a young man, and as I continued to just go back and forth from there throughout my childhood. And then from a creative perspective, really created or molded the entire group's image, Arrested Development's image. It created our purpose and our direction. All of these things were influenced by these quote unquote simple people that were many times uneducated, but had the most sense of purpose and the most sense of dignity of anybody else that I knew. And yeah, a lot of our concepts in our group, life music, came from being down there and seeing the life of the people there. The earthiness of our group came from there. The men and women being united within our group, I saw that happening in the South. The elders being uplifted in our group, I saw that in the South. The different body types, I should say, that were around me on a daily basis, I wanted to include that in our group, in a hip hop group. The whole idea of not being so materialistic and not relying on those things to give you value, I got from being down there. So, I mean, a lot of valuable stuff I feel like I got from these people. Moving to Atlanta even was an amazing thing for me. I once again saw this self-determination. You know, I'm from Milwaukee. Milwaukee has a very, very serious glass ceiling in a sense, where Black people often feel frustrated because they can only get but so far. And you also see a very stark contrast between the haves and have-nots in Milwaukee. And unfortunately, many of the have-nots happen to be Black, and many of the haves happen to be white. So there's this really stark contrast in Milwaukee. So coming to Atlanta, it felt like a little Africa to me, even though at that time I had not been to Africa, but it felt like what my mind's eye felt Africa is like. And it was filled with opportunities and thriving communities of Black folk in particular, filled with a lot of Black educational centers like the AU Center and Clark Atlanta University, Morehouse, Morris Brown at the time, Spelman. So there was this historical or educational centers that was inspiring. There was cultural centers like the West End in Atlanta that was just bubbling with cultural ideas and cultural pride and identity as Black people. There was artistic areas in Atlanta like Little Five Points where it was very artsy and that part was celebrated. There's historical activism that goes without saying in Atlanta. I mean, where Martin Luther King Jr., of course, had his activism in Atlanta primarily. John Lewis, Joseph Lowery, Coretta Scott King, Julian Bond. I mean, Rosa Parks even. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. So there was just all of these centers of pride and historical context. And not to mention the beauty. I mean, gorgeous women in Atlanta. I felt that being down there. So it was just a lot of just great inspiration. You know what I mean? And it was the first place I saw prominent Black government officials that were ensuring Black inclusion, literally within the laws, and trying to ensure equity. Maynard Jackson was a huge influence and inspiration. Andrew Young. So, I mean, these were things that I saw just moving down south to Atlanta.
After you explain that, and I've heard you talk before about what you saw in the West End and folks wearing dashikis and just the whole sense of Black nationalism and pride. it makes me wonder whether or not you could have become Speech, whether or not you could have put together an Arrested Development had you not gone back to the South. Would that have been possible?
No. But I will say this. Milwaukee has its own, despite all of the oppression and the stark contrast that I saw in Milwaukee, it also has within it a really serious activism piece. And it inspired me. But there was also this piece of feeling stuck in Milwaukee. And so I would say that I would not have been able to thrive as much doing the same concept of Arrested Development as I was in Atlanta. Atlanta, it gave me more vision to see around me people doing these types of things, living these types of lifestyles, and an inspiration to dream, but dream big. And Milwaukee didn't do that. It also allowed for me to see more Black excellence in Atlanta and Black progression in Atlanta. The city's optimism, especially in the early 90s, it helped in the late 80s too. It helped for me to forge a path forward with the group and with our branding, which we didn't use terms like brand back then, but nowadays people use that so much, so I'll just use it now. But like our branding and our mission and what we were trying to accomplish and striving to do. So yeah, I definitely think it made a huge difference.
So of course, one of the reasons we're talking to you is because you were you in the forefront of what has become known as Southern hip hop. But the funny thing is, to me, and I think Robert kind of alluded to it, is that some people think about Southern hip hop and they think about Outkast and the Source Awards in 1995, or I guess in Andre 3000. But you all had won awards a few years before that for your breakout album.
Yeah.
And so I'm just kind of trying to figure out, how would you characterize Southern hip hop, especially given what you started to put together in the late 80s and eventually put together on the album, the debut album in the early 90s?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question because unfortunately there has been a rewriting of history in a sense. And to a large extent, it tries to sort of make the movement of Southern hip hop start at that speech that Andre 3000 gave at the Source Awards, right? It sort of makes it start there as opposed to 3 years earlier,
right,
with undeniable accolades that came from us. So in other words, winning 2 Grammys, winning 2 MTV Awards, selling millions of records, all from the South, which at that time the Ghetto Boys hadn't accomplished. At that time, so many other Southern groups that did incredible work hadn't done that same thing. And especially from Atlanta, nobody had done that same thing at that time. Criss Cross definitely was in the discussion as well, being from Atlanta, and did even further things than us. So I'm not trying to take away from their successes either. I often say,
right,
even today, Atlanta, it represents forward movement, but it's not nearly as focused and as revolutionary as it once was. There has been a diluting, if you will, particularly from subject matter and topics like strip clubs and trap houses and gang culture that has diluted the revolutionary spirit that once existed when we were coming through Atlanta. So I think that has to be discussed. But like for us, we knew that, prior to Dungeon Family, which produced Outkast and produced, Goody Mob and so many other great acts, that we were already forging this path for Atlanta and for the South. So yeah, it has to be noted.
And what would you say that path was for you? Because we weren't calling it Southern hip hop then. We were just talking about Arrested Development. So what was that path that you were trying to forge?
For us, it was to, number one, make the South a legitimate place for authentic and credible hip hop. The South, back in these days, New York and LA held the sort of the mantle for what hip hop is and can be and should be from then on. Like, it was very hard to accept at that time that hip hop could come from anywhere else, to be honest. And for us, we were having to prove that no, it can, it is, and it's relevant, it's important. And so our videos were purposely juxtaposing what the imagery was showing from New York and LA. So if anyone that's old enough that can remember what was happening at that time, New York was consistently, basketball courts, chain fences, projects, the Bronx, these types of images. Our images were literally opposite of that. We're showing grandmamas and rocking chairs and rural Southern motifs and looks, but it's still hip hop. So you still see the sort of the pillars of hip hop with the turntables and the obviously the rhymes, but then we're wearing these clothes that are non-materialistic, no gold chains, but maybe an African medallion, and we're doing the very opposite of what was becoming sort of etched in stone as to what hip hop is and the limits to where hip hop can go. We're doing the opposite of that. We got an elder in the group. We got men and women in the group. Believe it or not, at this time, this is pre-Fugees. This is pre-Black Eyed Peas. The only group that had shown men and women in the same group in hip hop was the Funky 4+1. And that was much earlier in the 70s with hip hop. But these things just were not commonplace at the time. And to many degrees, we were the first to bring it into the consciousness of hip hop. So, yeah, I mean, that's what I meant by forging a path.
Now, you've talked a lot about the history of hip hop, and indeed, history is an important part of our podcast. I want to go back to something you just mentioned a moment ago about how Arrested Development has sort of been, I won't say forgotten about, but it's been overlooked in the history of hip hop, Southern hip hop in particular. And you're right that oftentimes we start with Andre 3000 at the 95 Source Awards. Why do you think that's the case? Why do you think that so many people who otherwise enjoy and embrace Southern hip hop start there as opposed to going just a few years earlier and talking about what Arrested Development was doing?
That's a great question. I think it's for two reasons. One is hip hop has been taken over by corporate interests. And these corporate interests do not like the sloppy narrative that there was conscious, revolutionary hip hop coming out of the South. It prefers this narrative that it was always sort of the guys rising out of poverty to talk about the drug game from their perspective instead of New York's perspective or LA's perspective. The hustle game, the street culture game coming from the South perspective and not LA's perspective or New York's perspective. They would rather that be the narrative. It's just cleaner and it makes more sense for people that only know hip hop of today, and especially the hip hop from the South of today. It just makes more sense to start it from there instead of started from what can be perceived from that perspective as a messy truth, that there was revolutionary, conscious hip hop coming straight out of the South that talked about Pan-African concepts, that talked about Africa and African Americans being and having deep, deep similarities and sharing a similar struggle, that talked about non-materialism and lifted up Black women. When you juxtapose those things that I mentioned with a lot of what has come out the South in more recent years, it just doesn't mesh together. It's a tough footnote to sort of explain. And then, of course, you got some people who are purists and feel like, well, okay, Arrested Development speech comes from Milwaukee, Razadon comes from New Jersey, Deion Ferris comes from Jersey, Ishi is from Atlanta and went to high school with a lot of the groups that would come out later. But there's not a purity of those that came from the South in Arrested Development. And I think that there's some who would also just want to start from that clean point where it's like, okay, well, we all come from the same projects or we come from the same area in Atlanta. So let's start there. It's just a cleaner narrative.
And, interestingly enough, we've talked to, folks who are in their 70s, closing in on 80s, and we asked them about what the South was to them and what it is today. You arrived, although you had those visits every summer that you talked about, you arrived in 1987. So you've been pushing almost 40 years in the South. So what is the concept of the South to you now, the New South as opposed to the South that you arrived in?
What I see as the New South concept tends to be more of a melting pot type of idea. And I understand that those things are happening, but for me, I stay more focused on what I see has been culturally robbed from us and what I still see is extremely important for us to understand and come from that perspective as we progress and move forward into the future. So, yeah, I tend to stay in my head in a sense as I navigate the South.
And before we let you go, you are a Southerner, correct?
That's how I look at myself now, bro. I mean, don't get me wrong. I come from the Midwest. I'm proud of Milwaukee. I'm proud of the Midwest and how it's impacted me. But my wife, my kids, I've been most of my life in the South. And so a small part of my life and a very important part is from the Midwest, but most of my life is the South. So yeah, I look at myself as a Southerner. Yeah.
And so what's your favorite Southern dish?
Well, it's not healthy, so I'll just start off with that. But I love my wife's family cooks extremely well, like some of the best food ever. And so mac and cheese with tons of butter and grease in it and cheese in it. But it's absolutely divine and it tastes incredible. Mac and cheese, they're greens. It's got some meat in it and all of that, but it just tastes divine. So, I mean, these are the things that are staples for me. They're not things that I eat often, to be honest. But as far as when you say favorite, yeah, that's where it is. That's where it is.
Wow. That's interesting.
Spoken like a true Southerner.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is great, man. This is very enjoyable.
Well, y'all, I appreciate these kind of interviews. I don't get these often, so I appreciate it.
Kaylee Cuoco and Sam Claflin star in the MGM Plus original series, Vanished. When the man Alice loves disappears on a train to the south of France, every romantic memory becomes evidence. Every intimate detail, a potential threat. She thought she knew everything about him, but she may not even know his real name. 4-part thriller Vanished premieres February 1st on MGM Plus. Finding the truth is a dangerous affair.
From the history of radioactive makeup to all the loony things Henry VIII did to ensure we never stop making movies about him, Weird History is a podcast that answers all the questions you didn't even know you had about the most unbelievable people, places, and events of the past. Based on the hugely successful YouTube channel, Weird History invites you to bone up on what it was like to use a public bathroom in ancient Rome while learning about the single worst year of all time. Don't worry, we missed it by a millennium or so. Then get the skinny on modern history, like the true story behind The Conjuring, and just what the hell Steven Seagal did to get banned from SNL. Let Weird History be your guide to the stranger side of history they don't teach you in school. Because the past is weird, a lot weirder than you think. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Our next guest on today's episode of Our New South is Dr. Regina Bradley. Dr. Bradley is an award-winning writer and researcher of the Black American South. She presently serves as Associate Professor of English and African and Diaspora Studies at Kennesaw State University and is an alumna of the Nasir Jones Hip Hop Fellowship at Harvard University. And for those who don't know, that is Nas. So you know that's a pretty big deal. Dr. Bradley is the author of the critically acclaimed book, Chronicling Stankonia, The Rise of the Hip Hop South, which details the impact of hip-hop group Outkast on Southern hip-hop culture. Dr. Bradley has also written for the Washington Post, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and National Public Radio. Our New South welcomes Dr. Regina Bradley. Today, we are very thrilled and happy to welcome to our program Dr. Regina Bradley. Dr. Bradley, as always, we ask our guests to tell us a bit about themselves and tell us what they're up to these days. So, Dr. Bradley, welcome to Our New South.
Thanks for having me. I'm just trying to recover from the semester.
Aren't we all?
I feel your pain there. And tell us about the university you're based at.
So I'm at Kennesaw State University, which is about 30 minutes outside of Atlanta on a good day, because 75 doesn't let nobody be great. But yeah, so it's pretty large school. I think we're number 2 in the state in terms of population. It's great. I love my students. They love me until it's time to grade their stuff. And then that's how it is. Yeah. So pretty nice size PWI right outside the city of Atlanta. I've been there since 2017.
Fantastic. And of course, we're going to talk a bit more about being at Kennesaw and being within the city limits of Atlanta. But first, we want to talk a bit about your background as a Southerner, because you've written extensively about not just Southern hip hop, but this larger idea of Southern Blackness. So tell us a little bit about how that Southernness affects what you do, what you work on, and your life. And first, we were talking right before we began recording here about where you're originally from. So tell us where you're originally from and how your ideas of the South were shaped by moving from one place to the other.
So I'm a military brat. I was born in Hawaii, which is that's the global South, I guess. I'm a military brat. I was born in Hawaii, but my mother was stationed on the East Coast. So we lived in Beaufort, South Carolina for a little bit, and we moved to Virginia Beach, and then we moved to the DMV, Fort Belvoir, Alexandria, to be specific. So I had, I guess, a little bit of insight into what Southernness was, but most of my ideas of Southernness are grounded in my yearly trip to go see my grandparents in Albany, Georgia. Albany. Some folks come for me when I don't say it right. Albany, DeBenny, Georgia. So I've always had a strong connection to the South from just that relationship in itself. And then I moved to Georgia permanently at the age of 14, right before I started high school. I brought Go-Go with me, just what we were talking about before I started to record. And, my new classmates and friends were like, what is that? I was like, don't even worry about it. It's the DMV thing. It's cool. It's cool. So, yeah, I was trying to, do the whole awkward teenager thing and fit in. But, the music that I was listening to in the DMV, from 93.9 and 95.5, you know what I'm saying? Yeah, they weren't listening to that in South Georgia. They're like, no, we don't care. We don't care about that. We're listening to this. Anything coming out of Atlanta, anything coming out of New Orleans, anything coming out of Memphis, Houston. So I literally had to change my ear in thinking what is and what is not hip hop. So that's how I kind of got into this larger discussion about what Southernness is and what it's not. And it really was grounded home for me when I was in graduate school at Indiana University. My professor was talking about hip hop, but most of the scholarship about hip hop was focused on New York. And I'm just like, I'm not from New York. That's not what I'm listening to in my car at the moment. So what's up? She was like, well, what are you going to do about it? And I'm like, at the moment, nothing. I'm just trying to get out of this class. It was the best B I ever earned in my life. So yeah, it was graduate school and then, finished the whole graduate training, and there still wasn't anything about Southern hip hop. And that's when I decided, I was like, yo, let's change something about that. So that's where, the initial seeds of Chronicling Stankonia came out of, was those experiences. Yeah.
Right. And I wanted to ask you about that because in the introduction, you have this in your book, Chronicling Stankonia, The Rise of the Hip Hop South. You have this brief idea of Southness versus Southernness.
Yeah.
And what I find interesting about this is our podcast, Our New South, is very much about what makes the South different now, how it has changed over time. But what you point out here is you talk about Southness or Southern experiences hinge on the American South as a physical location into Southernness, the socio-cultural conceptualization of Southern life without the restrictions of regional affiliation. Could you talk a bit more about this idea of Southness versus Southernness? Because it sounds like it fits very much into your larger theme of Southern hip hop is real, it exists, and needs to be discussed further.
Yeah, so I think a lot of folks get stuck on the idea of the South from this very historicized kind of, the South is a lost cause, right? Like the South is only Confederacy. The South is, and that does a huge disservice to the Black folks, the indigenous folks, everybody else who's not white and Confederate. That's like, well, what about us? What about our experiences? You know what I'm saying? And I was thinking about it from the perspective of a Southern Black woman who is also a military brat, who also, left the South to go for school. And I'm like, this is definitely not the physical location of the South, but I still have my Southernness with me. Like I didn't just up and leave and go from Georgia to Indiana and forget, all of my upbringing, my the way that I talk, the way that I thought about things, the way that I saw the world was still very much rooted in a Southern experience. So that's where I finally kind of theorized the distinction between, Southness, which is the actual location itself, and Southernness, which people took with them. So I think that is important, is to not collapse the idea of Southernness just to a physical regional space, but to also think about what the cultural, landscape looks like, because it's mobile, it moves, it changes, it shifts. And you hear that not only, in jazz and blues, but also in hip hop. You know what I mean? What Atlanta hip hop sounds like is different than Houston or New Orleans or Memphis. So I think that idea of Southernness opens up space to have these larger conversations about why the South is this complex space, both culturally, socially, all of the ullies.
I have like 10,000 questions, but I think Kevin needs to step in because I know he's got some questions too. So this is already excellent. I'm already loving this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Bradley, for this. And thank you for exporting go-go music from your time in the DMV, which is where I'm at, and try and get that into other people's eardrums.
Mm-hmm.
And you've approached the South through that idea as not being this monolith, which I think a lot of us think of when we think of the South. And you've also spoken about being a child of the civil rights era.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're kind of wondering how you believe that hip hop culture has become an integral part of Black Southern identity since the civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm.
Because you once stated that you see Southern hip hop as an opportunity to build a bridge between the past and the present, which, by the way, is one of the things that the Levine Museum of the New South, which sponsors us, talks about, the bridging between the past and the present. So if you can talk about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, I was raised by my grandparents, my grandparents and my dad. And my grandparents came of age in the Jim Crow South. So the Jim Crow South is not only one of the most visible representations of Southern experiences, but also one of the most traumatic, right? There's just certain things you couldn't do. And, the way that they came up is the way that they raised me. You know what I mean? They were like, education is the portal to success and going to college. And when I spoke to white folks, I was supposed to speak to white folks in a particular type of way, right? Like not to embarrass the family. So there was definitely, touchstones of Jim Crow identity that I was instilled with. The flip side of that is, when I went to school, when I went to the mall, when I went to the skating rink, it was like, we weren't having these conversations about, how to make the Black South a kumbaya space. We weren't talking about how we overcome. No. We were like, so can you drop it like it's hot? Can you, what does, is the city of Atlanta really as popping as it is? Like, all of these different questions that were now central to the conversations I was having with my grandparents at home. They were asking these questions. They were embracing these experiences that the civil rights era generations couldn't embrace because they never experienced it as a young person. You know what I'm saying? So it was like, hip hop was my gateway to modernity in the South. One of the reasons that I love Outkast, for example, is they very much have a spiritual element to them. But the spiritual is also combined with the secular. And I'm thinking in particular about the Bombs Over Baghdad video, where you got, a strip club with a choir singing, power music, electric revival. And you're just like, well, what are the strippers doing at the church? And why is that, why is this, So it was allowing me to ask these uncomfortable questions. And I think my grandparents thought that I was trying to dismiss what the civil rights movement did. But the reality of it was I was trying to get a better understanding of it because, it was kind of on this pedestal. And in order for me to really appreciate it, the pedestal had to get kicked over. So when I was writing Chronicling Stankonia, that's one of the first things that I theorize. I'm like, everybody wants to reference Dr. King. Everybody references the I Have a Dream speech, right? But what people don't ask about is, what if the mountaintop's not flat? What if it ain't flat? I mean, like, we're on the mountaintop. Okay, great. How do we navigate it? We've never been here before. And I feel like Southern hip hop is one of the soundtracks that explores what that mountaintop looks like from a non-perfectionist perspective. So when I started writing Chronicling Stankonia in 2015, it stemmed from a dialogue series that I did called Outkasted Conversations. And the only reason that I did Outkasted Conversations was because everybody was focusing on the 20th anniversary of Nas's Illmatic. Rightfully so. I'm not knocking Illmatic. Like, don't come for me. I'm just saying. And I was like, well, you know that Outkast came out with Southern Playalistic at the end of the same month. Like Illmatic came out in April of 94, the beginning of April of 94, and Southern Playalistic was at the end, April 26th, right? So it was like, why aren't we having this conversation about Outkast and what they have contributed to hip hop? Because they changed the game. Outkast comes to the 95 Source Awards. I mean, like, I'm really fascinated that more people have not written about the 95 Source Awards because so many things were happening that night. You got Biggie that's there. You got, Snoop Dogg, who was like, y'all don't love us. And this whole East Coast, West Coast rivalry is still going strong. And then you got these new cats coming out of Atlanta, of all places, up for Best New Rap Group against like a group like Smith & Wesson, who's from New York. You know what I'm saying? They're like, oh, it's just going to be a guarantee. So you get there and you have Andre come out, and clearly he's starting to go through his change before Erykah Badu. Everybody wants to give Erykah Badu credit for Andre, becoming, this eccentric artist. But I mean, you saw like inklings of this right after Southern Playalistic. He was there in his purple and white dashiki. You know what I mean? He was like, the change was evident, and you can tell that he's clearly frustrated, very upset, irritated. You know what I'm saying? Irritated. He's like, I'm done with y'all. And he's like, the South got something to say. And it always fascinates me because it's like, he didn't say, I got something to say. He didn't say that Outkast got something to say. He said the South. There was this awareness that the Southern hip hop that was about to happen was bigger than him. Right? So that opened up the door for these different, Southern hip hop hubs to become apparent. You know what I mean? It was a form of representation that Southerners had not seen in hip hop at that time. It was like, oh, it's okay to be Southern and do hip hop on our own terms. We don't have to, copycat New York to be legitimate hip hop. Just that explosion of Southern rap that comes out after that, right? In New Orleans, you got, the rise of No Limit. You know what I'm saying? In Memphis, you got the rise of 3 6 Mafia. You got UGK coming out of Houston, Port Arthur. So it was a moment where folks were like trying to come together. One of the things that also fascinates me is just the sense of camaraderie that you saw amongst Southern artists. Like, just, do you want to collaborate? You want to do something? I mean, it was fascinating. Like that, the late 90s, early 2000s in the South was a moment. Right? It was, it was a movie, as y'all say. It was like...
Right. And moving to South Carolina, I can tell you it's the same here. Just living here, living in Columbia, working in Orangeburg, and having friends from Charleston, I can tell you there are different South Carolinas as well. Then not even including the Gullah Geechee community, having friends from that community and all of that, which leads me to sort of the big meta question that we always ask our guests, which is, you're from Albany, you study Atlanta and the modern hip hop South. But there's this idea that's in the title of our podcast, Our New South. Mm-hmm. When you hear that phrase, New South, what does it mean to you, especially as a daughter of the modern South?
Yeah. Well, the thing that's interesting just about the South in general is, something that I tell my students is that the South is cyclical. It's not linear. You know what I mean? Like, something doesn't just happen and we never talk about it again. We are continuously revisiting the past. There's always one foot in the past, and one foot in the future. We don't quite know what to do with the present. So when I hear the term Our New South, I feel like it's folks are trying to figure out what that Southern present looks like in conversation with the past, because so many people rely on the past to understand who we are. I also think, too, that a big part of that question is the role of the internet and social media in how we understand the South. Who's the our, right? Like, is it just folks who were born and raised in a Southern state? Is it folks who have migrated here and have become part of the landscape? Is it just a free-for-all? Which I feel like that's not academically rigorous, but in some ways I do feel like we're in this current moment of a free-for-all. Like, if you want to be from here, then be from here. It makes me think about Drake and Kendrick. Because with Drake, I said previously, like, Drake is hip hop's most famous carpetbagger. And you have to understand Southern history to understand what that means. Like, he started off in Memphis because his dad had roots in Memphis. Then he went to, he made up this place, Houston, Atlanta, Vegas. And then he was in Louisiana. And then he went to Miami. And then he was in the Caribbean. I think he's back in Houston or Atlanta or something like that. So by the time that we get to, the beef, right? Kendrick is calling out the receipts. And even with a Kendrick Lamar, you hear the influences of Southern hip hop, especially if you listen to Damn, the Damn album. You hear the influences of New Orleans. You hear the influences of Houston. You hear the influences of Atlanta. So I just really think like our new South is experiencing like growing pains in terms of like, what do we keep from the past that is useful in understanding who we are, but how do we also make room for these newer experiences that previous generations of Southerners probably haven't experienced, to make room for those younger Southerners to also speak their truth. You know what I'm saying? And I think that, that's probably one of the biggest things is, how do you speak your truth as a Southerner and not have it disregarded because it's not an experience that everybody can relate to?
And along those lines, can you differentiate between the hip hop streams out of those different cities that you've studied, beyond Atlanta, the Memphis sound, the Houston sound, the New Orleans sound? And what is it about hip hop that has turned it into a global phenomenon, and specifically Southern hip hop? Because I actually listened to a rap podcast out of the UK called Southern Hospitality by this guy. DJ Rob Person. Okay. And it's just interesting to hear him talk about his attraction to this genre of hip hop.
Memphis is unique because it definitely integrates the blues, right? In a really unique way. And I feel like in the same way that I'm talking about Atlanta, I'm going to also reference other scholars who are discussing these things. So Zandria Robinson, right? In her book, This Ain't Chicago, talks about like the blues aesthetic and what you hear in hip hop. And also like, what does being from a city like Memphis look like in conversation with other major cities? In this instance, she picked the city of Chicago. You know what I'm saying? When you think about New Orleans, right, you can't help but think about the jazz and bounce aesthetic, right? Bounce is not hip hop. Bounce is like New Orleans' go-go. You know what I'm saying? It's like, it's really, you got to kind of figure out how to describe it. I'm like, there's elements of hip hop in it. You have crossover, you know what I mean? Like, I'm thinking in particular about Manny Fresh, DJ Manny Fresh, who's been around since like the 80s, right? Who implemented these different types of sound, right? When we talk about the ratchet, it comes from Louisiana. It's from Louisiana, right? So, you have scholars like Brittany Cooper, like Alex Chapman, right? Like Matt Miller, who came out with a book called Bounce, who are talking about these unique perspectives of it. If you go over to Houston, you're having conversations about soul music, like the soul influence, especially if you're thinking about Pimp C, Long Live the Pimp. You know what I'm saying? And UGK, what they were doing with that chopped and screwed aesthetic is also unique to Texas. When Beyonce uses chopped and screwed, people think that she is being demonic. Because they don't know, they're not familiar with chopped and screwed. So you have folks like Mako Faneuil and Langston Collin Wilkins, right, who are doing work in Houston. When you have conversations about North Carolina, people forget that North Carolina is part of the South. They don't want to admit it because it's this whole other debate about Virginia and, Richmond South, I think, because Richmond North feels like they are the DMV, but Richmond South and North Carolina, no, we're not Southern, we're the Mid-Atlantic, You know what I'm saying? Which is fascinating to me because you have these quote unquote mid-Atlantic artists like Timbaland, like the Neptunes, like Pharrell, who call themselves Southern. So I'm like, what's up with that? Right? Missy, who are doing these things, right? And then, what's interesting about North Carolina is like that connection, especially because of Ninth Wonder, the producer Ninth Wonder, with Jay-Z and Rockefeller. Like if you listen to like J. Cole or you listen to Rhapsody or even Little Brother to an extent, like you hear like those influences of New York, right? But it's still distinctively Southern from a North Carolinian perspective. And then one of the favorites, which is Florida, you know what I mean? If it's Fort Lauderdale and South, they don't even consider themselves Southern. They consider themselves the Upper Caribbean. You know what I mean? Because of all the influence of Upper Caribbean. If you're talking about the Florida Panhandle, that's just South Georgia. Like you hear like those influences. And then there's other Southern states that don't get enough study. You know what I mean? Like Alabama. Alabama has a hip hop scene. You know what I mean? Like you have, Dirty, you got Flo Milli, you got Rich Boy. You know what I mean? Like it has its own unique element of it. Mississippi is a different one, from Tupelo with Ray Shrimmer to Big Crit to, David Banner and Brad Franklin. You know what I'm saying? So it's like hip hop has manifested and made itself unique in all of these different states. All of these different trends and all these different, significant core moments have happened in Southern hip hop, and they are crossing over because folks are seeing value in it. I had a friend of mine visit Tibet and sent me a link of Tibetan monks chanting to trap music. Like they were chanting to trap beats. You know what I'm saying?
Well, this is great. I really enjoy what you've done in your work.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That means a lot.
This has been an inspiration, definitely. Yeah. And I want to say, as someone who also studies the Black South, Franklin Stankonia is really important to me as a work of not just hip hop studies, but also as a work of history. So again, thank you for everything you've done and everything you will do.
Yeah, I could talk about this all day.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, Robert, this sure was a fun session. That was the episode I think a lot of us were waiting for, and a perfect wrap-up to this season to get back to the slogan at the start of both seasons, which is the South got something to say. And the South really does have something to say. And to think of hip-hop in the South as a revolutionary voice in what you think about the South and how people fit into the South, particularly people of color, was really eye-opening. And I really love the fact that Dr. Bradley really took that to another level. I mean, she's brought a seriousness and a scholarship to the art of hip-hop. And she's in the forefront of that movement that has really shown what hip-hop music can be all about.
I've been very fortunate to know Dr. Bradley for years now and to have read much of her work. And really, her scholarship came through in this episode. And a point that she made time and again was how the South is not just a place, it's an idea. We also got this from Speech, who was really adamant about the importance of the rural South that we often forget about in the 21st century. But both of these guests had so much to say about all the themes we've been covering both this season and last season about how there isn't just one South, there isn't just one new South. But at the same time, we have to remember there are plenty of folks in the South today who don't quite feel the same enthusiasm or joy or energy about that new South because they're being left behind.
Yeah.
And I think hip hop speaks for them too and says, hey, don't forget about us.
And I think that's one of the great things about doing this podcast, Our New South. We got into it in the first season. We certainly got into it even more in the second season. So many issues that people in the South are engaging in and not running away from. I mean, if we think about the idea of reverse migration in the South right now, that's because people they have accepted what the South is. They've engaged in its battles. They've won many of them, and they are celebrating that very fact. And so I think, for me at least, growing up on the cusp of the South in the Washington, D.C. area, I have a new appreciation for the South as a place to live, for the South as a place to work, for the South as a place to protest, as a place to grow, and maybe more importantly than anything, as a place to push the rest of the country forward as much as it can.
Absolutely. So goes the South, so goes the entire nation. And I think this season of Our New South really proved that. We had a lot of listeners this year for our episodes, even more than season 1. And I have to say, Kevin, this has been a wonderful, wonderful ride. Thank you. Thank you to the Levine team. Thank you for the Next Chapter podcast. And thanks especially to the listeners who have made season 2 a truly special experience for all of us.
Yes, they have.
You know what I'm saying? It's like we got a demo tape and nobody want to hear it, but it's like this is South got something to say.
Our New South is presented by Levine Museum of the New South. Levine Museum connects the past to the future to realize the promises of a New South. To learn more and donate to projects like this, visit museumofenewsouth.org.
Our New South is produced by Next Chapter Podcast. Thanks to editor and sound designer Kyle Murdoch, producers Brian Douglas, Alexander Piñeres, and Cliff Whitfield, senior producer and writer Byron Hunter, and executive producers Jeremiah Tittle and Frankie Abbott. Please follow the show, subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Learn more at nextchapterpodcast.com/Our New South.
Thanks for listening.
South got something to say.
From the history of radioactive makeup to all the loony things Henry VIII did to ensure we never stop making movies about him, Weird History is a podcast that answers all the questions you didn't even know you had about the most unbelievable people, places, and events of the past. Based on the hugely successful YouTube channel, Weird History invites you to bone up on what it was like to use a public bathroom in ancient Rome while learning about the single worst year of all time. Don't worry, we missed it by a millennium or so. Then get the skinny on modern history, like the true story behind The Conjuring, and just what the hell Steven Seagal did to get banned from SNL. Let Weird History be your guide to the stranger side of history they don't teach you in school. Because the past is weird, a lot weirder than you think. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Next Chapter Podcasts.